My parents hid my college acceptance letters in my dad's desk, then told my school I'd be dropping out to focus on being a wife. When I said I wasn't ready to get married, my mom smiled and said, "Parental consent makes it legal in California. We already checked." I stayed silent. That was 3 weeks ago. Yesterday, she was being loaded into an ambulance, screaming that everyone was trying to ruin her perfect day. What happened when you broke your parents' rules? My parents had one rule that they treated like the 11th commandment, which was absolutely no dating until after high school graduation. They would lecture me constantly about how teenage relationships were just distractions from academics, and how every girl who dated in high school ended up ruining her future. They even made me sign an actual contract on my 14th birthday, promising I wouldn't date until I was 18. My dad laminated it and hung it on the refrigerator like some kind of warning poster. I spent every single school dance sitting at home watching Netflix while my friends sent me videos of them slow dancing with their boyfriends. When people asked why I never went to anything social, I had to make up excuses about being too busy with violin practice that didn't exist. My mom would actually drive by the movie theater on Friday nights to make sure she didn't see me there with anyone. Their paranoia was so intense that when a boy from chemistry class asked to borrow my notes, my dad interrogated me for an hour about whether we were secretly meeting up. Every male contact in my phone had to be labeled with their full name and how I knew them so my parents could verify they were just classmates. Then I met Zeke during junior year at my volunteer job at the animal shelter, where my parents encouraged me to work because it would look good on college applications. He was a senior from a different school who came in every Saturday to help with the dogs. Since my parents didn't know him and we worked in different sections of the shelter, we could actually talk without anyone reporting back to them. After 3 months of sneaking conversations between walking dogs and cleaning kennels, he asked if I wanted to study together at the library. That turned into secret coffee runs during my supposed tutoring sessions, and eventually actual dates at restaurants across town where my parents would never go. We kept everything completely hidden using a messaging app that looked like a calculator on my phone. I became an expert at living this double life where I was the perfect rule-following daughter at home and actually experiencing normal teenage life when they thought I was at debate practice or studying with a friend. But then one Thursday night, my appendix decided to basically explode inside my body. The pain hit during dinner, and within minutes, I was curled up on the bathroom floor feeling like someone was stabbing me with a hot knife. And I could barely breathe enough to tell my parents something was seriously wrong with my stomach. My mom took one look at me and immediately decided I was being dramatic about period cramps because that's what she always assumed whenever I felt sick. My dad agreed and said I just needed to take some ibuprofen and sleep it off. When I started throwing up and couldn't even stand up straight, they accused me of trying to get out of my calculus test the next morning. They actually sent me to bed and told me to stop being so theatrical about normal teenage girl problems. By midnight, the pain was so bad I was seeing spots and could barely stay conscious. But my parents had gone to bed and turned off their phones like they always did. I managed to crawl to my phone and text Zeke that something was really wrong, and I thought I might be dying, which sounds dramatic, but genuinely felt true in that moment. He didn't even hesitate before saying he was coming to get me whether my parents liked it or not. 20 minutes later, he was throwing rocks at my window and helping me climb down the trellis in my pajamas, while I tried not to scream from the pain. He carried me to his car when I couldn't walk anymore, and drove 90 miles an hour to the emergency room while I sobbed in the passenger seat. The doctors rushed me into surgery immediately because my appendix had actually ruptured, and I was going into septic shock, which could have killed me if Zeke had waited even another hour. When I woke up from surgery, my parents were standing next to my hospital bed looking completely destroyed. Zeke was still there in the waiting room even though it was 6 in the morning and he'd been up all night. The surgeon told my parents that Zeke had saved my life by getting me to the hospital when he did, and that their son was a hero for recognizing how serious the situation was. My mom started crying and hugged Zeke while my dad shook his hand and kept apologizing for not believing me about the pain. On the drive home from the hospital 3 days later, my parents were completely silent until my dad finally cleared his throat and said they needed to apologize for everything. My mom admitted they'd been too strict, and that clearly I'd shown good judgment in choosing someone like Zeke who cared enough to risk getting in trouble to save my life. They said I could date him officially, and even have him over for dinner to thank him properly. I was so relieved I started crying until my mom turned around in her seat with this huge smile and said the words that changed everything. "We've decided you two are so perfect for each other that you should get married. We already put down the deposit on the venue. The wedding is next month." My surgical incision started throbbing harder as I gripped the car door handle and stared at my mom's excited face. She kept talking about roses versus lilies while my dad nodded along, and I wondered if the morphine was making me hallucinate this whole conversation. The rest of the drive home was a blur of wedding details that my mom rattled off while I pressed my hand against my stomach and tried not to throw up from either the pain meds or the shock. Once we got home, I went straight to the bathroom and locked the door before pulling out my phone to text Zeke with shaking hands. I typed, "They want us to get married, next month, not joking," and hit send before sitting on the closed toilet lid. His response came back immediately with 17 question marks followed by, "Are your parents having a mental breakdown?" while I could hear my mom downstairs on the phone with someone about catering menus. I dragged myself to my bedroom and collapsed on the bed where that stupid laminated dating contract still hung on my wall like some kind of joke. The one I'd signed at 14 promising not to date until 18 was right there mocking me while my parents planned my wedding 4 months before graduation. My stomach hurt worse than the surgical site as I stared at the ceiling until Hannah peeked her head through my door. She whispered that Mom had gone completely insane and was looking at wedding dresses online, which made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. At dinner that night, my dad slid a 3-inch binder across the table with color-coded tabs labeled venue, catering, and guest list. I opened it to find 200 names already typed up in alphabetical order with addresses and phone numbers. I pushed my soup bowl away and told them firmly that I was 17 and couldn't legally get married, but my mom just smiled. She chirped that parental consent made it legal in California, and they'd already researched all the requirements at the courthouse. 2 days later, Zeke showed up for the thank you dinner my parents had promised him, wearing the only button-down shirt he owned. My parents beamed at him like he was already their son-in-law while he kept shooting confused looks at me across the table. I mouthed, "Play along," while making frantic eye contact as my mom served his favorite foods that she'd somehow figured out from stalking his social media. She'd made chicken parmesan and chocolate cake because apparently she'd gone through 3 years of his Instagram posts. After dinner, we sat on the porch swing while my parents watched us through the living room window like we were some kind of zoo exhibit. Zeke whispered that we'd only been dating 4 months and he hadn't even met my parents officially until today. My surgical site ached as I explained how my parents thought they were doing something wonderful by completely flipping from one extreme to another. They'd gone from banning all dating to planning our wedding in the span of 3 days like that was totally normal. The next morning, I found out my mom had already called my school about special circumstances for early graduation. She'd told them my medical hardship from the surgery meant I needed to accelerate my diploma so I could focus on married life. The guidance counselor called me directly, completely confused about the request, and asking if everything was okay at home. I had to pretend the connection was bad, and hung up before she could ask more questions about why my mother thought I was getting married. Grace came over that afternoon for our regular study session, but my mom intercepted her at the front door with a stack of wedding invitations. She handed Grace a calligraphy pen, and told her to start addressing envelopes while I watched from the stairs in horror. Grace's eyes went huge as she read, "Sarah Mitchell and Zeke Harrison request the honor of your presence," printed in fancy gold lettering. She mouthed, "What?" at me from across the room, while my mom explained how we needed to get these mailed by Friday. That night, I tried to have a rational conversation with my parents about wanting to finish high school normally and go to college. My dad responded that married students get better financial aid, and Zeke could support me while I studied part-time. My mom added they'd already put down $8,000 in non-refundable deposits, so backing out wasn't an option. She'd booked the country club, hired a photographer, and put a rush order on a custom wedding dress in my measurements. The next morning, Hannah knocked on my door holding her phone with a look of pure panic on her face. She showed me screenshots from our mom's Facebook where she'd announced the engagement to all our extended family. I'm really curious. Ask about how the parents went from zero to wedding planning in just 3 days. How did they even research all those legal requirements about parental consent so fast? The post had photos from Zeke's Instagram that she'd edited to look like professional couples portraits with some kind of filter app. Comments were pouring in with shocked congratulations, and my aunt from Texas had already commented that she was booking flights. I grabbed my phone and called Dr. Desai's office while Hannah watched me with worried eyes. The nurse who answered recognized my name and asked how my recovery was going. I explained about the wedding situation and asked if maybe the doctor could write something saying I needed more recovery time. She went quiet for a moment, then said the doctor couldn't get involved in family matters unless there was actual abuse happening. My parents being weirdly nice about forcing me to get married didn't count as the kind of thing doctors could stop. I hung up feeling completely trapped while Hannah just shook her head. 3 days had passed since the announcement and things were getting worse by the hour. Zeke texted me that his parents had just called him screaming because they'd gotten a formal invitation in the mail. The fancy card invited them to dinner to discuss their children's future together. His mom was a paralegal, and she was already looking up whether teenage marriage was even legal in California. He said he was sitting in his car outside my house but was too scared to come in. He didn't want to leave me alone, but also didn't know how to face my parents anymore. That night, Pastor Thompson came over for dinner and he looked super uncomfortable the whole time. My parents kept talking about how they were blessing young love and giving us the perfect start to life. He tried suggesting that couples should do counseling for at least 6 months before getting married. My mom just laughed and said true love didn't need to wait when it was obvious we were meant to be. While my parents argued about whether to have roses or lilies for the centerpieces, Pastor Thompson looked at me and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." He left right after dessert saying he had another appointment, but I could tell he just wanted to escape. A week after my surgery, I finally went back to school, and it was a complete nightmare. Everyone had seen my mom's Facebook post and thought I was actually getting married by choice. Kids I'd never even talked to were coming up to congratulate me in the hallways. My chemistry teacher pulled me aside and said marriage was a big responsibility, but she was happy for me. I tried explaining it was all a misunderstanding, but nobody believed me. The worst part was the rumors that started spreading about why the wedding was happening so fast. By lunch, everyone had decided I must be pregnant, which would explain both the emergency surgery story and the rushed wedding. Grace found me crying in the bathroom and dragged me to the library where she'd gathered our friend group. She'd made a group chat called Save Sarah, and everyone was throwing out ideas to stop the wedding. Someone suggested faking a pregnancy scare for Zeke to freak out my parents. Another friend wanted to call Child Protective Services and report the whole thing. I told them none of it would work because my parents would just see any interference as jealousy or people trying to ruin my happiness. They'd probably just move the wedding up even sooner if they thought people were trying to stop it. When I got home that afternoon, I found my mom's old wedding planning notebook in the garage. It was from when she was 17 and full of magazine cutouts and handwritten notes about her dream wedding. She'd planned every detail from the dress to the flowers to the song for the first dance. Then at the bottom of one page, she'd written, "Canceled because of baby," with the date she found out she was pregnant with me. Everything suddenly made sense about why she was so excited about this wedding. She was living out the teenage wedding dreams she never got to have through me. That night at dinner, the venue coordinator called about final menu selections for the reception. My dad handed me the phone saying I should pick what I wanted since it was my special day. I deliberately chose the most expensive option for every course, hoping to price them out of this insanity. My mom just clapped her hands and said nothing was too good for her baby girl's wedding. The coordinator said the new total would be almost double the original estimate, but my parents didn't even blink. Meanwhile, Zeke met up with his older brother, who was in law school, to figure out our options. His brother explained that parents could legally consent to teenage marriage, but I could file for emancipation from my parents. Or I could wait until I turned 18 and file for an annulment saying I was coerced. The legal stuff was so complicated, and we were just two kids who wanted to date like normal teenagers. Later that week, Hannah came to my room and closed the door behind her, looking serious. She pulled out her phone and showed me that she'd been secretly recording our parents' conversations for days. She played me a clip of our mom talking to someone on the phone about how I needed structure in my life. Mom was saying that marriage would keep me from making the same mistakes she did as a teenager. Hannah had been recording everything to help me have evidence if I needed it later. The next Saturday, my parents surprised me by driving to a wedding dress shop without warning. The consultant already had dresses pulled based on what my mom had told her over the phone. They made me try on dress after dress while my mom cried about her baby getting married. I stood on the platform in a $3,000 dress feeling like I was in a nightmare. Other customers kept staring at me and whispering to each other. One woman asked if we were from one of those religious groups that married off their daughters young. I didn't. The consultant kept giving me sympathetic looks but didn't say anything. My mom finally picked a dress with way too many sparkles and a train that went on forever while I stood there feeling numb. We left the store with the dress in a huge pink bag and drove home in silence except for my mom talking about flower arrangements and whether we should have chicken or fish at the reception. The next morning at school, I was walking to my locker when Grace's mom appeared in the hallway and gently touched my shoulder. She worked as a social worker at the county office and had this soft voice that made you want to tell her everything. She asked if we could talk privately and led me to an empty classroom where she closed the door and sat on one of the desks. I explained how my parents thought they were helping me by planning this perfect wedding to the boy who saved my life, and how they really believed this was the best thing for my future. She listened without interrupting, and then pulled a business card from her purse. "Coercive control is still control, honey," she said quietly before leaving me alone in the classroom. After school, Zeke picked me up in his beat-up Honda, and we drove to the park where nobody would see us together without our parents watching. He turned off the engine and stared at the steering wheel for a long time before suggesting we could just run away somewhere. I reminded him we had no money and nowhere to go, and I was still getting dizzy from the surgery whenever I stood up too fast. We sat there holding hands and watching kids play on the swings, while both knowing we were completely trapped. 2 days later, when my parents were at work, I went into my dad's study to look for stamps and found a stack of opened envelopes hidden under his tax papers. 3 college acceptance letters with scholarship offers that needed responses by next month were sitting there with the edges torn open. Northwestern offered me almost a full ride for their journalism program, and 2 state schools had given me merit scholarships that would cover most of my tuition. When my mom got home, I showed her the letters, and she just shrugged and said they were protecting me from distractions during wedding planning. That Sunday, we sat in our usual pew at church while Pastor Thompson stood at the pulpit and started talking about how God gave young people free will for a reason. But he kept looking right at my parents while he talked about how forcing children into adult decisions before they were ready went against everything the Bible taught about patience and wisdom. My mom's face turned red, and my dad's jaw got so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. The whole congregation kept glancing at us and whispering to each other while Pastor kept preaching about letting teenagers grow at their own pace. After the service, my mom cornered Pastor in the parking lot and told him if he ever targeted our family again during a sermon, we would find a new church. The next day, a photographer showed up at our house with a bunch of equipment for engagement photos my parents had scheduled without telling me. My mom handed me a yellow sundress she'd bought and told me to put it on and smile like I meant it. Zeke arrived looking miserable in the button-down shirt his mom had dropped off for him to wear. We stood in the backyard while the photographer positioned us under the oak tree and told us to look happy and in love. Hannah kept sneaking into the background, making bunny ears and sticking her tongue out, which made the photographer have to retake every single shot. She pretended to pick her nose in one photo and made obscene gestures with her hands in another until my dad dragged her inside and grounded her for a week. We had just finished the photos when a taxi pulled up and my Aunt Martha from Texas climbed out with 2 suitcases and marched straight up to the front door. She took one look at me in the sundress with Zeke beside me and demanded to know why her 17-year-old niece was dressed like a bride. My mom tried to explain about the wedding being a celebration of Zeke saving my life, but Martha cut her off and said she was living out her failed dreams through me. The way everyone's trying different methods to help Sarah escape is so interesting. How did Grace's mom know exactly what to say about coercive control? Makes me wonder if she's seen this kind of situation before in her social work job. They started screaming at each other in the living room, while Martha accused my mom of being jealous that she never got her dream wedding when she was young. My mom's face went from shocked to hurt to furious in about 3 seconds before she told Martha to get out of her house. The next morning, Zeke's parents finally showed up for the meeting my parents had been demanding, and they brought their oldest son, who was a lawyer in Sacramento. His mom, Diane, set a folder of legal documents on our coffee table and started explaining all the statistics about teenage marriages and divorce rates. My dad responded by pulling up Zeke's Instagram on his phone and showing them photos of us together at the animal shelter, claiming their son had been secretly pursuing me for months. The tension in the room got so thick I couldn't breathe, so I escaped upstairs to the bathroom where I found Hannah already hiding in the bathtub with her headphones on. We sat together on the cold tile floor while the voices downstairs got louder and louder. Hannah pulled out her phone and whispered that she'd been recording everything our parents said and uploading it to cloud storage just in case I needed it later for court or something. The arguing downstairs turned into full screaming when Diane suggested my parents were psychologically abusing me by forcing this wedding. My mom completely lost it and started shrieking that they had raised a predator who targeted innocent girls at volunteer jobs. She literally pushed them out the front door while yelling that Zeke had manipulated and corrupted me. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Zeke sitting in his parents' car saying his mom was calling CPS and this whole thing had gotten completely insane. The next day at school, Grace gathered 5 other friends and they cornered me in the chemistry lab during lunch with a whole presentation they'd prepared. They had printed articles about forced marriage and statistics about teenage divorce and pamphlets from legal aid organizations. They surrounded me at the lab table and took turns explaining why this wedding was a terrible idea and how they could help me get out of it. I started crying so hard I couldn't even see the papers they were showing me. I told them I didn't know how to stop this without destroying my whole family and making my parents hate me forever. Grace's mom picked me up from school that afternoon and drove me home in silence while I stared out the window feeling like my whole world was falling apart. When I got home, my mom was in the kitchen surrounded by wedding magazines and fabric samples, humming to herself while she wrote notes in a pink notebook covered in heart stickers. She looked up at me with this huge smile and started talking about how she'd found the perfect shade of ivory for my dress and how the florist had these amazing roses that would match perfectly. I mumbled something about needing to use the bathroom and went upstairs where I noticed her purse sitting open on her dresser. Something made me look inside, and that's when I saw the prescription bottle for her anxiety medication tucked behind a stack of wedding planning books. The bottle was completely full, even though she'd gotten it refilled 3 weeks ago, according to the label. My hands started shaking as I realized she hadn't been taking her pills at all, and suddenly her manic energy about this wedding made horrible sense. I heard a car pull up outside and looked out the window to see a woman in a gray suit getting out with a clipboard and official-looking badge. My stomach dropped as she walked up to our front door and rang the bell while I stood frozen at the top of the stairs listening to my mom answer it with her fake, cheerful voice. The woman introduced herself as being from Child Protective Services and said they'd received a report about concerns regarding a minor in the household. My dad appeared from his office and both my parents started talking at once about how this must be some terrible misunderstanding. They invited the investigator into the living room where my mom immediately pulled out her phone to show texts she claimed I'd sent about being excited for the wedding. She showed the woman newspaper clippings about Zeke saving my life and the thank you card from the surgeon saying what a hero my boyfriend was. The investigator nodded and took notes while my parents painted this picture of grateful parents trying to support their daughter's relationship with the boy who saved her life. Everything seemed to be going their way until Hannah came downstairs and stopped in the doorway. She looked at the investigator, then at our parents, then back at the investigator and said the 2 words that changed everything. The investigator's head snapped up and she asked Hannah to repeat what she'd just said. My parents tried to interrupt, but the woman held up her hand and asked to speak with me privately. My mom's face went white as the investigator followed me up to my room and closed the door behind us. She sat on my desk chair while I perched on the edge of my bed, my surgical incision throbbing from stress. She asked me direct questions about the wedding and whether I wanted to get married. I kept looking at my hands, torn between telling the truth and protecting my parents who I knew loved me, even if they were being crazy. I told her they were just overwhelmed with gratitude towards Zeke, and maybe got carried away with wanting to thank him. She wrote everything down and asked to see my surgical scar, which was still red and swollen. She took pictures of it and said she'd need to follow up in a week to make sure I was healing properly, and to check on the situation. After she left, my parents were eerily quiet at dinner, just passing dishes without making eye contact. The next morning, they both left for work early, and Pastor Thompson showed up around 10, finding me on the porch swing trying to read, but mostly just staring at nothing. He sat down next to me and admitted he'd been counseling couples for 20 years, but had never encountered anything like this situation. He said he could refuse to perform the ceremony on religious grounds since I was still a minor and hadn't completed premarital counseling. But he warned that my parents might just find someone else who wouldn't ask as many questions, maybe even drive to Vegas if they got desperate enough. 3 days later, with only 10 days until the supposed wedding date, I was looking for my calculus textbook in my mom's car when I found a folder labeled Sarah's Future. Inside were emails she'd been sending to all my teachers explaining that I would be transitioning to online school after my wedding so I could focus on being a wife. My hands went numb as I read her promises that I'd complete my senior year from home while adjusting to married life. The next morning, my principal called me to his office where he sat me down and showed me the emails my mother had sent. He leaned forward with genuine concern in his eyes and said he could intervene if I asked him to, that the school had resources to help students in difficult family situations. I opened my mouth to say yes, to ask for help, to admit everything was insane, but nothing came out. I just sat there frozen, unable to betray the parents who had raised me, even though they were destroying my future. That evening, Aunt Martha showed up while my mom was at her book club and cornered my dad in the garage where he was pretending to organize his tools. I could hear them through the door as she told him she knew about Mom's bipolar diagnosis from when they were younger, something my parents had hidden from us kids our whole lives. She said if they didn't cancel this wedding immediately, She would tell me and Hannah everything about Mom's history of manic episodes and hospitalizations. My dad's voice cracked as he begged her not to say anything, insisting that Linda was fragile right now, and this wedding was the only thing keeping her stable and happy. 2 days later, Hannah found me in the bathroom at 2 in the morning, fully dressed and sitting under the cold shower spray, while tears mixed with the water running down my face. She didn't say anything at first, just climbed in next to me in her pajamas and took my hand. I finally admitted that I'd been having panic attacks ever since the surgery, waking up gasping for air and not knowing if it was trauma from almost dying or terror about this wedding that was somehow actually happening. We sat there under the cold water until our fingers turned pruny and our teeth chattered, neither of us knowing what to say. Meanwhile, Zeke had been skipping his morning classes to sit in the public library surrounded by law books about emancipation and minor rights. The librarian, an older woman with kind eyes, noticed his stack of legal texts and quietly sat down next to him. She mentioned that her daughter had gone through something similar with controlling parents and slipped him a business card for a family law attorney who worked pro bono for teenagers in crisis situations. That night at dinner, my mom was serving pasta when she suddenly slammed a manila folder on the table in front of me. Inside were my college acceptance letters that I'd hidden in my closet. Letters from schools I'd applied to secretly using the school counselor's address. She waved them in my face while screaming that I'd been planning to abandon them all along, that I was selfish and ungrateful after everything they'd done for me. My dad took her side, saying college could wait until after I was settled in marriage, and that a good wife focused on her family, not her career. The spot where they'd removed my appendix started throbbing and burning like it was going to split open from the stress. I ran to Grace's house after dinner, and her mom took one look at my wrists where my mom had grabbed me during her screaming and immediately got out her camera. How did Hannah know exactly what to say to make the investigator pay attention like that? The way she found all those legal documents in the car makes me wonder if the mom planned this for way longer than anyone realized. She documented every bruise and red mark while explaining that she was a mandated reporter, and that physical control combined with forced marriage constituted abuse regardless of what my parents claimed their intentions were. She filed the report that night while I sat in their kitchen drinking tea with shaking hands, knowing that in 8 days my parents expected me to walk down an aisle in a white dress and promise to obey a boy I'd only kissed 3 times. The next morning, Zeke picked me up 2 blocks from my house while my parents thought I was at my follow-up doctor appointment. We drove to a small law office downtown where Jennifer Walsh was waiting with coffee and a stack of papers that made my stomach drop. She explained my 3 options while I sat there feeling like I was going to throw up again. Emancipation would take months and require proving I could support myself financially, which was impossible when I couldn't even work yet because of my surgery. Refusing at the actual ceremony would humiliate my parents in front of everyone they'd invited, but wouldn't stop them from trying again. Running away until I turned 18 meant losing my health insurance right when I needed it most for my post-surgery care and medications. I left that meeting feeling more trapped than before while Zeke held my hand and promised we'd figure something out together. 3 days later, the wedding dress arrived for final alterations at the boutique my mom had picked. The seamstress was pinning the hem when I suddenly stood up and announced I was calling off the wedding completely. My mom's face went white before she started gasping for air and collapsed right there on the boutique floor. The staff called 911 while I knelt beside her as she gripped my hand so hard it hurt and kept gasping, "Don't leave me," over and over. I rode in the ambulance holding her hand while the paramedics gave her oxygen and checked her vitals. At the hospital, they stabilized her and moved her to a private room where I sat in the corner chair. I heard the doctor talking to my dad in the hallway about her bipolar medication and how she hadn't been taking it properly. They discussed putting her on an involuntary psychiatric hold if she kept refusing treatment, but my dad begged them to wait. He actually told them the wedding planning was therapeutic for her, which made me want to scream. Zeke came to visit me in the hospital cafeteria while my mom was sedated upstairs. We sat at a corner table drinking terrible coffee and discussing whether we should just break up publicly to end everything. But we both knew it would probably push my mom completely over the edge, and neither of us wanted that on our conscience. He said quietly that we were trapped by their mental illness, and I couldn't even argue with him about it. The next day, Hannah came to my room and showed me her phone with thousands of comments on a Reddit thread. She'd been posting about our situation anonymously for days, and it had gone completely viral with people offering advice and sharing similar stories. She showed me messages from journalists wanting to interview us, but I made her promise not to respond to any of them. My mom came home from the hospital the next morning more determined than ever about the wedding. She started calling all the vendors demanding they move everything up by 2 days because she didn't want to risk anything else happening. When I tried to protest, she grabbed my phone and laptop and locked me in my room. She said it was for my own good until the ceremony, and that I'd thank her someday for protecting me from myself. Hannah managed to slide my phone back through the heating vent between our rooms that night. I immediately texted Zeke and Grace and the social worker from the hospital who'd given me her card. Grace's mom told me through Grace to call 911 if I was being held against my will, but I couldn't do that to my already unstable mother. The next morning, Pastor Thompson showed up for what my mom called mandatory premarital counseling. He found me locked in my room and demanded my mom let me out immediately, or he'd call the authorities himself. She finally unlocked the door, but then sat right next to me during the entire session, interrupting every time I tried to say anything. The pastor kept writing notes while watching my mom's behavior, and I could tell he was documenting everything carefully. 4 days before the wedding, my aunt showed up again, but this time she brought backup. My mom's estranged sister Patricia was there along with my grandmother, who I hadn't seen in 5 years. The living room turned into a battlefield with decades of old fights exploding all at once. Patricia suddenly announced that my mom had been hospitalized for postpartum psychosis after I was born, which nobody had ever told me. My mom started screaming that Patricia was lying while my dad tried to calm everyone down, and my grandmother just sat there crying. During all the chaos, Hannah grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back door. We ran to Grace's house where her mom was already waiting with Jennifer, the attorney from before. Jennifer had emergency paperwork for a temporary restraining order spread out on their kitchen table. My hands shook so bad I could barely hold the pen as I signed my name, knowing this would destroy my relationship with my parents forever. Grace's mom set up blankets on their couch, but I couldn't even close my eyes without seeing my mother's face twisted with rage from earlier. Around midnight, I gave up trying to sleep and sat by the window watching the street outside while my phone buzzed nonstop on the coffee table. The missed calls from my mother kept climbing past 30, then 40, each voicemail getting more frantic and threatening until I finally turned the phone face down. At 3 in the morning, a familiar car crept down the street, moving so slow the headlights barely shifted across the walls. My dad's sedan passed Grace's house once, twice, then a third time before parking 2 houses down with the engine still running. I watched him sit there for 20 minutes just staring at Grace's front door before my phone lit up with a text that made my hands go cold. The message from my dad said my mother was talking about hurting herself, and I needed to come home right now. I was still staring at those words when the 4th pass happened, and this time the car stopped right in front of the house. Blue and red lights suddenly filled the room as 2 police cars pulled up behind my dad's sedan. The doorbell rang at 3:30 in the morning, and Grace's mom went downstairs in her bathrobe while I pressed myself against the wall trying to hear what was happening. The officers were explaining that my parents had reported me as a runaway, and they needed to verify I was safe. No, but Grace's mom tried showing them the restraining order paperwork Jennifer had prepared, but one of the officers shook his head and said it hadn't been filed with the court yet, so it wasn't valid. My parents stood behind the police looking perfectly calm and concerned like any worried parents would. My mother had even changed into regular clothes and fixed her makeup so she looked completely normal instead of the screaming mess from hours earlier. The officer explained I could either come home voluntarily or they'd have to investigate further, which might mean pressing charges against my parents for false imprisonment if I claimed they'd been holding me against my will. Grace's mom argued that I was 17 and should have some say in where I stayed, but the officers kept repeating that without filed paperwork, I was still a minor under my parents' custody. My dad stepped forward and promised they just wanted me home safe and that everything would be fine. The way my mother nodded along with tears in her eyes made it look like they were the victims of a rebellious teenager. I knew fighting would make everything worse and might get Grace's family in trouble, so I grabbed my stuff and followed my parents to their car, while Grace watched from her bedroom window. The drive home was completely silent except for my mother humming wedding songs under her breath like nothing had happened. When we pulled into our driveway, I saw why she was so calm. Our entire backyard had been transformed into a wedding venue, with white chairs arranged in perfect rows facing an archway covered in fake flowers. Catering tables lined the side of the house, and strings of lights created a canopy over what would be the dance floor. My mother walked me through the setup, explaining where the photographer would stand and how the guests would enter through the side gate. She pointed out the special chair decorations for family members and the spot where the cake table would go, talking like we were planning a normal party instead of a forced wedding between teenagers. My dad pulled me into the kitchen while she continued adjusting flower arrangements, and his hands were shaking when he grabbed my shoulders. He begged me to just go through with the ceremony to keep my mother stable, explaining she'd been planning nonstop for 3 days without sleeping, and he was scared what she might do if we canceled now. He showed me receipts for everything she'd already paid for, including the catering deposit and DJ, and said we'd lose thousands of dollars if we backed out. The next morning, Zeke showed up with his parents and older brother who'd driven down from law school. They all sat in our living room while my mother served coffee and cookies like this was a normal family meeting. Zeke's brother pulled out legal documents and suggested a compromise where we'd have a commitment ceremony that looked like a wedding but had no legal binding. He explained it would be like a promise ring ceremony that would let my mother have her event, while protecting both of us from actually being married. My mother's face went through about 10 different expressions before she finally agreed, but insisted we couldn't tell any of the guests it wasn't real. Zeke's brother showing up with fake wedding papers is such a smart move. Did he come up with that idea himself, or was this something they'd been planning? She made us all promise to act like it was a real wedding, so she wouldn't be embarrassed in front of family and friends. That afternoon, Jennifer called to tell me she'd filed for an emergency custody hearing, arguing I needed a guardian appointed by the court due to my parents' mental health crisis. The hearing was scheduled for Monday, which was the day after the ceremony my mother had planned for Sunday. Jennifer said if I could just survive through the weekend, then the court would likely intervene and remove me from the home. 2 days suddenly felt like the longest time in the world, but also the only hope I had left. Friday night was the rehearsal dinner at a restaurant my mother had rented out completely. Extended family had driven in from 3 different states, and everyone gathered around tables decorated with white roses and baby's breath. My aunt, who'd always been suspicious of my mother's behavior, stood up to give a toast, and I could see my mother tense up immediately. Instead of wishing us well, my aunt announced to all 40 guests that this was a sham wedding between minors, orchestrated by a mentally unstable mother who needed psychiatric help. The room exploded into chaos with half the family yelling at my aunt while the other half agreed with her. My mother stood up and started screaming that everyone was trying to ruin her special moment before she grabbed a wine glass and threw it against the wall. She kept throwing plates and glasses while sobbing that nobody understood how much she loved me and just wanted me to be happy. My dad and two uncles had to physically restrain her and carry her out to the car while she screamed threats at everyone who'd betrayed her. Back at home, my dad finally broke down and admitted he'd been enabling my mother's illness for years because he was terrified of her suicide threats. He pulled out a notebook from his desk drawer and showed me pages of documentation about her manic episodes going back to when I was 5 years old. Each entry showed how her breakdowns were triggered by me reaching normal milestones like starting kindergarten, or getting my first period, or turning 16. He'd been tracking the pattern but never got her help because she threatened to kill herself every time he suggested therapy or medication. The notebook had dates and descriptions of her threatening to drive off bridges or take pills if he didn't support whatever she wanted. Later that night, Hannah came into my room holding scissors from the kitchen drawer. She sat on my bed and suggested we could cut all my hair off to make me too ugly for wedding photos, so maybe Mom would cancel. We both started laughing even though we were crying because we knew even that wouldn't stop her at this point. She'd probably just buy me a wig and pretend everything was fine. Hannah held my hand and said she was scared about what would happen to her when I left, because Mom would need a new project to obsess over. Early Sunday morning before anyone else was awake, the pastor knocked on my bedroom door. He sat on my desk chair and told me he'd been in contact with Jennifer about the custody hearing and would testify about everything he'd witnessed. He also said if I gave him any signal during the ceremony, like dropping my bouquet or saying the wrong name, he would object and stop the whole thing. He'd already prepared a speech about how the marriage couldn't be blessed by God because it was forced and involved minors. I woke up 2 hours later to find my mother sitting on my bed holding the laminated dating contract she'd made me sign when I was 14. She had scissors in her hand and was cutting it into tiny pieces that fell onto my comforter like confetti. She looked at me with this twisted smile and said she'd been wrong to control me with rules and contracts because this wedding proved she trusted me to make adult decisions now. The doorbell rang and my mom jumped up to answer it while I sat there staring at the pieces of my old contract scattered on my bed. Grace walked into my room carrying a bridesmaid dress in one hand and a backpack in the other that she dropped behind my dresser with a look that said everything. My cousins, who were supposed to be the other bridesmaids, stood in my doorway whispering about whether they should even be here for this crazy wedding. Hannah had her phone out texting everyone about how to stop this mess from happening while pretending to take selfies with the dress. My mom came back dragging this huge white wedding dress that looked like something from a fairy tale and told me to start getting ready because guests would arrive in 2 hours. I stood up to take the dress and felt something wet on my stomach where my surgery scar was supposed to be healing. When I lifted my shirt, there was blood seeping through the bandage and the incision had split open about an inch from all the stress. I showed my mom thinking this would finally make her cancel everything, but she just grabbed some makeup and fashion tape from her bathroom. She pressed the tape over the bloody bandage and covered it with concealer while telling me nothing would ruin this perfect day. My phone buzzed with a text from Zeke saying his parents had called reporters and news vans were already outside the venue, but my mom didn't know yet. Hannah had posted the whole story on Reddit last night, and now actual news crews wanted to cover this forced teenage wedding. The doorbell rang again, and Dr. Desai walked in still wearing her hospital scrubs, looking really worried. She'd heard from other doctors at the hospital about what was happening, and came to check on me since I was only a week out from major surgery. She took one look at the blood seeping through my dress and dragged me to the bathroom to examine the reopened incision. Her hands were shaking as she cleaned the wound and said I was medically unfit for any stress right now. She threatened to call an ambulance if my parents tried to make me go through with this ceremony. My mom heard her talking and burst into the bathroom screaming that everyone was trying to sabotage my happiness. She grabbed my arm and started pulling me toward the backyard where they'd set up all the chairs and decorations. My dad finally stepped between us and grabbed my mom's shoulders to stop her from dragging me outside. She started hitting him and screaming that everyone was trying to destroy our family while guests watched from the windows. Someone must have called 911 because 3 police cars pulled up and officers ran into our backyard. Guests scattered in every direction as the cops separated my parents and tried to figure out what was happening. The paramedics who came with them took one look at my mom and started asking her questions about her mental state. She begged me to tell them she was fine, but I just stood there too tired to say anything anymore. They put her in the ambulance for a psychiatric evaluation, while she cried that she only wanted to give me everything she never had. I watched the wedding arch standing empty in our backyard, with flowers already wilting in the afternoon sun. My mom couldn't tell the difference between her own teenage dreams and what I actually wanted for my life. Later that evening, my aunt showed up and started sending guests home while calling vendors to cancel everything. She pulled out her phone and showed me videos she'd been recording of my mom's behavior for months. She said my mom had episodes like this before I was born, and the family had been dealing with her problems for years. A social worker named Jennifer arrived with emergency custody papers that would make my aunt my temporary guardian. My hands shook as I signed the papers while my surgical site throbbed with every movement. Zeke held my other hand as I realized I couldn't legally stay in my own house anymore. My dad sat at the kitchen table and finally broke down crying about how he'd remortgaged our house to pay for this wedding. He admitted my mom had been spending money they didn't have for years on crazy projects, and now we were completely broke. He said he needed help too, because he'd been enabling her sickness instead of getting her real treatment. The next 3 days passed in a blur of packing boxes and signing papers, while my Aunt Jennifer handled all the legal stuff with CPS. She drove me to my first therapy appointment in the small office building downtown, where the therapist had pictures of mountains on every wall. I sat on her brown leather couch and couldn't even form words for the first 20 minutes because everything felt too big to explain. The therapist just handed me tissues and waited while I stared at my hands and tried to figure out how love could turn into something so twisted. Hannah showed up at Jennifer's rental house that same afternoon with 2 suitcases and her stuffed elephant from when she was 5. We pushed the twin beds together in the guest room, and she crawled in next to me that first night like we used to do during thunderstorms. She told me she'd been seeing a counselor at school for 6 months already because she knew something was wrong with our family but didn't know how to help. 3 days later, Zeke picked me up for our first actual date, where we didn't have to lie or sneak around. We went to the pizza place near his school, and then saw some action movie, but halfway through I realized we had no idea what to talk about without a crisis happening. We sat in his car afterward and agreed to basically start over and actually get to know each other like normal people. The custody hearing happened 2 weeks later in this huge courtroom that smelled like old carpet and coffee. Pastor Thompson testified about my parents' concerning behavior at church and how they'd isolated our family from normal activities. Dr. Desai explained my medical records and how close I'd come to dying from the ruptured appendix. Grace's mom described finding me at their house multiple times crying about my parents' rules. The blood seeping through her wedding dress while her mom just covers it with makeup and tape? What was going through her mom's mind that made her think that was okay? Jennifer presented all the evidence, including recordings Hannah had secretly made on her phone of our mom's meltdowns. My mom sat at the other table looking smaller than I'd ever seen her in this gray dress I didn't recognize. She stood up when it was her turn and admitted she had bipolar disorder and had stopped taking her medication 2 years ago. She said planning my wedding felt like the most love she'd ever shown me, even though she understood now how wrong it was. The judge listened to everything and then said mental illness might explain behavior, but it didn't excuse putting children in danger. He signed the papers, making Jennifer our legal guardian right there in the courtroom. 2 weeks after that, I went back to school and everyone stared at me in the hallways like I was some kind of celebrity or victim. Some kids wanted to take selfies with me because they'd seen the Reddit thread that had gone viral. Others whispered behind their hands or gave me these pitying looks that made me want to hide in the bathroom. I focused on catching up on all the assignments I'd missed while my teachers kept asking if I needed extensions or counseling. My AP classes were a disaster, and I had 3 weeks to get my grades up before college application deadlines. Jennifer drove me back to my old house to get my clothes and school stuff on a Saturday morning when we knew my parents would be at their therapy appointments. The wedding arch was still in the backyard, covered in dead flowers and bird poop. Inside my room looked exactly the same, except for the 3 holes my mom had punched in the wall next to my bed. We packed everything into boxes, while I tried not to look at the family photos still hanging in the hallway. Grace picked me up the next day and declared we were having a normal teenage girl day with absolutely no mention of parents or court or trauma. We got our nails done in bright pink and ate way too much ice cream at the mall food court. At the movie theater, we ran into kids from school who kept staring but didn't say anything about the story everyone had read online. For 3 hours, I remembered what it felt like to just be 17 and worry about normal stuff like whether my nail polish matched my outfit. A month later, my dad's therapist called Jennifer to ask if I'd come to a family session with him. I sat in that beige office while my dad cried and said he'd failed me by choosing my mom's stability over my safety. He admitted he'd been scared of her getting worse if he challenged her, but realized that made him responsible for what happened. I couldn't forgive him yet, but I told him I appreciated him finally taking responsibility. That same week, I got an email from the admissions office at Berkeley, asking for a statement about my family circumstances. My hands shook as I read it because I thought they were going to reject me for all the chaos. Instead, they offered me a special scholarship for students overcoming family trauma, and said they had support services ready if I needed them. Jennifer helped me write a response explaining everything, while I cried with relief that maybe my future wasn't completely ruined. About a month later, Zeke's parents called Jennifer's house and asked if I could come for dinner that weekend. I sat in their living room feeling weird about being there after everything that had happened with CPS. His mom brought out this huge plate of homemade lasagna, while his dad kept refilling my water glass every time I took a sip. They both started talking at once about how sorry they were for calling CPS without talking to me first. His mom grabbed my hand and said their house was always open if I needed somewhere safe to go. The next week, Hannah and I went to the support group Jennifer found for kids whose parents had mental health problems. We sat in metal folding chairs in a church basement, listening to other teenagers talk about their mom's bipolar episodes or dad's schizophrenia. One girl described her mother planning her 16th birthday party 12 different times, and I started crying because it sounded exactly like Linda. Hannah sat there with her arms crossed until this boy talked about being angry at his older sister for not protecting him from their dad's mood swings. She finally looked at me and said she was mad that I never saw how messed up our family was until it was too late. We stayed after the meeting ended and sat in my car for 2 hours, while she told me about all the time she'd hidden in her closet when our parents fought. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived at Jennifer's house with my parents' lawyer's return address on it. Inside was a 10-page letter from Linda written in her tiny handwriting that went back and forth between apologizing and explaining why she'd done everything. She mentioned she was planning a vow renewal ceremony for her and Robert next spring, with a butterfly theme and real monarch butterflies they'd release. The lawyer called that same afternoon to tell me my parents had filed for bankruptcy because of all the wedding debt plus Linda's credit card bills. He said my college fund was gone, but Jennifer had already started a GoFundMe that raised $12,000 in 3 days from people who'd been following my story online. Complete strangers were sending $20 and $50 donations with messages about how brave I was for sharing everything. Graduation day came faster than I expected, and I was adjusting my cap in the bathroom mirror when Grace texted that my parents were in the auditorium. But security guards were already moving toward them, but I walked over and told them it was okay because I realized I could handle being in the same room with them now. Linda cried through the entire ceremony while Robert held her hand and kept handing her tissues from his jacket pocket. After they called my name and I walked across the stage, Linda stood up and clapped so loud everyone turned to look at her. When the ceremony ended, she walked toward me with Robert right behind her, looking nervous and protective at the same time. She looked different with shorter hair and clothes that actually matched instead of the random bright colors she usually wore. She handed me a card with a check inside for $500 and said she was getting better while taking her new medication properly. I took the card and nodded, but didn't promise to call or visit because I wasn't ready for that yet. Pastor called Jennifer's house the next day, asking if he could do a special blessing ceremony for my future since the wedding blessing never happened. We met at the church on a Tuesday evening with Jennifer, Hannah, Grace, and even Zeke's whole family sitting in the front pews. He talked about journeys and healing and new beginnings while sprinkling holy water on my head, and it felt like what my actual wedding should have been. Zeke and I sat in his car afterward talking about what would happen when I left for Berkeley in 2 months. We both knew the trauma of everything had brought us together, but we needed to figure out if there was something real underneath all that. We decided to try long distance without making any big promises about forever, because we'd both had enough of forced commitments. The week before I left for college, I had to testify at the state capitol about teenage marriage laws and parental consent requirements. I sat at this long table with a microphone in front of me telling a room full of lawmakers about the wedding dress and the venue and the surgery. 3 different representatives said they were going to introduce bills requiring counseling before parents could consent to their minor children getting married. Moving day finally arrived, and Jennifer loaded my stuff into her SUV, while Hannah complained about having to ride 4 hours to Berkeley and back. We drove past my old house, which had a for sale sign in the front yard with a sold sticker across it. Linda was standing in the living room window watching the street, and our eyes met for just a second before Jennifer turned the corner. The rest of the drive was quiet except for Hannah playing games on her phone and Jennifer checking on me every few minutes through the mirror. Berkeley's campus looked huge when we pulled up to my dorm, and I watched other families unloading cars with matching bedding sets and brand new mini fridges. My stuff fit in 3 boxes and a suitcase, but Jennifer helped me carry everything up to the 3rd floor where my roommate was already unpacking. She looked up from arranging photos on her desk and her eyes went wide. "Wait, are you the girl from that Reddit post about the forced wedding?" I nodded and braced for judgment, but instead she sat on her bed and told me about her own mom who'd tried to make her marry her cousin back in Pakistan. We stayed up until 3 in the morning sharing stories about crazy families, and I realized I wasn't alone in having parents who'd lost their minds. 2 weeks later, I went to my first real college party, where nobody knew anything about my past except what I wanted to tell them. When some guy asked about my family while we were playing beer pong, I just shrugged and said it was complicated without having to explain the whole mess. The freedom of not owing anyone my trauma felt better than I'd imagined it could. I threw myself into classes and made friends who knew me as just Sarah, not the girl whose parents tried to force her into marriage. 3 months into freshman year, Hannah called me crying so hard I could barely understand her words. Mom was pregnant again at 43 after going off her meds during another manic episode where she'd decided medication was poisoning her body. I felt that old pull to drop everything and go home to help, but I stayed in my dorm room and talked Hannah through it over the phone instead. She was handling it mostly alone since Dad had moved into an apartment after finally admitting he couldn't do it anymore. Hannah keeping all those recordings on her phone shows such careful planning. I wonder how long she'd been documenting their mom's behavior before anyone else noticed. The way she prepared evidence makes me think she understood the situation way before Sarah. When fall break came, Zeke drove up from LA where he was taking a gap year working at his uncle's auto shop. We walked around campus holding hands like normal college kids, and he showed me his acceptance letter to Cal Poly for the spring semester. At the airport, he kissed me goodbye, and we both knew we were different people than the teenagers who'd snuck around Riverside. Neither of us mentioned the wedding that almost happened or made any promises about the future, because we were finally allowed to just be 19 and unsure. The divorce papers came through certified mail right before Thanksgiving, with a note from my dad's lawyer explaining that Robert had been in therapy for 6 months. Turns out he'd never wanted the wedding either, but couldn't stand up to Linda when she was spiraling into one of her episodes. The marriage that was supposed to be mine was ending for them instead, and I laughed alone in my dorm room at how backwards everything had gotten. Winter break came, and Jennifer picked me up to stay at her house instead of going back to Riverside. We baked sugar cookies and watched Christmas movies while Martha finally told me she'd known something was wrong for years, but Linda always threatened to hurt herself if anyone interfered. "I should have called CPS anyway," she said while we decorated a gingerbread house, and I told her we all did the best we could with what we knew. After New Year's, I started writing about everything that had happened on a blog I thought maybe 10 people would read. The first post about recognizing family dysfunction got 50,000 shares in 2 days, and my inbox filled with messages from kids in similar situations. Without meaning to, I became someone who helped other teenagers figure out how to escape their own family disasters. Hannah texted me in February that she'd submitted her early admission application to Berkeley with an essay about resilience and survival. She wanted the same fresh start I'd gotten and promised she was already saving money from her job at Target for the move. I helped her with scholarship applications and SAT prep over video calls, being the protective big sister I couldn't be when we were both drowning. Spring semester flew by with finals and planning for sophomore year when I'd finally declare my psychology major. 1 year after the wedding that never happened, a Facebook message popped up from an account I didn't recognize. It was Linda writing from a new profile to say she was stable, taking her medication, and working part-time at a craft store. She didn't ask to see me or beg for forgiveness, just wanted me to know she was trying to get better. I stared at the message for an hour before closing it without responding. But I didn't block her either because maybe someday I'd be ready to hear more. Now I'm sitting in my dorm room finishing my final paper about family systems and mental health, running my finger over the thin scar on my stomach that started everything. My phone keeps buzzing with normal 19-year-old stuff like Zeke sending stupid memes from his dorm, Hannah asking about twin XL sheets for next year, and Grace sharing party photos from USC. This is the life my parents tried to skip me past, thinking they were protecting me from bad decisions and heartbreak. Instead, they almost killed me with their protection, and I had to save myself from their saving. I closed my laptop and grabbed my backpack for study group, walking across campus in the California sunshine toward a future I'm finally choosing for myself, one normal teenage step at a time. Really enjoyed exploring all these questions with you today. Love just wondering about everything together. Hope to see you again soon. Subscribe for more content like this.